This month we're going to be making 4 different blocks again. The first one is the offset Shoo Fly, and the 2 pieces of fabric for that in the kit are the blue with the stars and the beige with the flags. So the first thing we want is to cut the blue into, we need 2 3-inch squares off of it. So I'm going to just cut a piece off that's a little bit over 6 inches long. We'll be using the rest of that for something else, and then I can square this up. If they're 2 3-inch squares, we need a 6 by 3-inch strip. And then after we get our 6 by 3-inch strip, we are going to just back the ruler up to the 3-inch mark. Line up lines with the long side to keep everything straight and cut. So that's my 2 3-inch strips. And then from the rest of this, I need 4 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide by 2.5 inches long. So 1.5 times 4 is 6. So I'm going to want a piece that is 6 by 2.5. Now I'm going to back the ruler up to the 4.5 inch mark. Then the 3-inch mark. And I'm always lining up lines on every side that I possibly can to keep everything straight. From our beige strip, we need 2 3-inch squares and 1 1.5 inch square. I'll go ahead and just clean cut my 2 sides. And I'm just going to cut this 3 inches wide for now. I want to back up and cut a 6-inch section off. Then back up again to 3 inches. So that gives me 2 3-inch squares. I think I'm wearing this cutting board out. Could be the blades too. And then from what's left, I just need a 1.5 inch square. So I'm lining my 1.5 inch mark up here, my 1.5 inch mark up here, cut and cut. You can either draw one line diagonally from point to point on the back of the beige squares and then sew 1/4 inch from that line on both sides, or you can use the magic wand or whatever other ruler you have for marking that 1/4 inch. If you're using the magic wand, we put the scored line on the corners and we mark on both sides of the ruler. And if you're doing it this way, then you're going to stitch on the lines. So now we're going to take our beige pieces, put it right sides together with our blue, and go stitch. Either way you do this, you're stitching 1/4 inch from the center on both sides. So you're either running your foot along your 1 line or you're stitching on the 2 lines. Once we have stitched both squares, then we're just going to cut the squares in half on the diagonal between our lines of stitching. We will press toward the blue, and once we've done that, we are going to trim our blocks down to 2.5 inches. If you have the block lock, this is the time to use it. Remember, you want to put it on so the groove is riding on your seam allowance. We want to make sure that the point is on the seam. We don't have a lot to trim off on this, just a little bit. Make sure that when you have it on here and you're going to be trimming here, you still have at least 2.5 inches Down on the other end. Trim. Rotate, slide the ruler back to the 2.5 inch mark now on the sides you already cut, and cut the last 2 sides. And you're going to do that to all 4 squares. If you do not have the block lock ruler, you can trim with another ruler. It would be easier with a square one, and I'm not going to do this, but if you have a square one, you can put your 45-degree line on your seam allowance. Again, check to make sure that you have 2.5 inches at least, and a little bit beyond if you can, to trim. Trim the 2 sides, rotate it, and then finish trimming it down to 2.5. Once all our half square triangle units are trimmed down, it's now time to put the block together. We're just making an irregular 9 patch, so this would be a row, this would be a row, and then this would be a row. We are going to press toward the blue on every row. My rows are sewn together, and I did press toward the blue. Now it's just a matter of sewing those rows together. The seams are going in opposite directions, so they will nest. I did forget to mention that you want your white triangles pointing in toward the center. In this case, the blue is the background on this block. Here's my finished offset Shoo Fly. You can press your seams in toward the center blue if you want to, but this is also a block where you can pop those seams, which is what I did, so that I have my going in different directions, and I have a flatter intersections here at the center. Our next block is the improved 4-patch. The pieces for that in the kit are a large red rectangle, a smaller green rectangle, and a smaller beige rectangle. From the red rectangle, we want to cut two 4-inch squares. So I'm just going to clean up the first 2 edges. Rotate, and we're going to cut it down to 4 by 8. So the 4-inch line on the long edge, the 8-inch line on the short. And back up to 4 inches. And these 2 squares are cut diagonally once, so that we end up with 4 half square triangles. And then we're going to cut the beige and the green rectangles down to 2 1/4 by 4 1/2. Now I'm going to stack them up and do it all at once. I'm also putting my right sides together so I don't have to handle them again later. So 2 1/4 wide by 4 1/2 long. Walk around this time since I have a stack so I don't disturb them. 2 1/2 by 4 1/2. So I'll put my 2 1/2 inch line on the long edge, my 4 1/2 inch line on the short, and then I'm going to take this pair to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 inch from the edge on both short sides. So basically I'm making a short fat tube. Once I've sewn on my 2 short sides, then I'm going to cut this in half between the 2 stitched lines. So half of the 4 1/2 would be 2 1/4. So I'm going to put the 2 1/4 mark on my cut edge, the short edge, and cut this in half. And when I open it up, I have 2 2-patch units, and we want to press those toward the green. Once I've pressed, I'm going to sew these together to make a 4-patch unit, so your greens would go on opposite corners. Again, our seams will be going in opposite directions, so they should nest when we're sewing. I don't remember what I said when I was cutting my little rectangles, whether I said 2 1/2 by 4 1/2. It should have been 2 1/4 by 4 1/2, which means my square is a little bit bigger than it should be. It should be 4 inches square, and because I cut 2 1/2 instead of 2 1/4, it's too big. So I'm just going to trim it down Too big is better than too small. So I just put my 2-inch mark on my seam line. I'm going to cut. My 2-inch mark on the seam line again after I rotate it and cut. So now I have a 4-inch square. It was 4 inches the other way. So see, I make mistakes too, and I don't always edit them out of the video. Okay, so now our next step is to sew our red triangles onto opposite sides of our 4 patch. So I'm going to sew 2 and then press toward the red, and then I'm going to sew 2 more and again press toward the red. It's all stitched and pressed. Now we're going to trim this whole block down to 5.5 inches. You're going to have just a hair more than 1/4 inch beyond your point, so this will sort of be floating. If you're just using any size square ruler and it has the diagonal line through it, then the 2 3/4 mark would go there on the center. So it would be right there. Should also be the 2 3/4 mark running up vertically and down as well, and then across. It should also be the 2 3/4 mark that's running through the point of our square. You do want to center your 4 patch in your block if you possibly can. Once you've made your first 2 cuts, you're committed. So now I'm still putting that diagonal line on the center to keep everything straight, but at this point this 5.5 mark, no matter which size ruler you're using, is going on the 2 edges you already cut. Come on. Our next block is Comfort Quilt. You have a beige strip, a green square, and they're calling this a rust strip, but our strip is more red than rust. Our beige strip we're cutting to 1 5/8 inches wide. So I'm going to fold mine in half because I'm working on a smaller mat and with a shorter ruler. So I put a line on my fold and to cut, and I am going to go ahead and clean cut my end. And either rotate your mat or walk around. Do make sure you're getting the right mark with your 1 5/8. So it's the one right beyond the 1/2 inch mark. So I've got it lined up along here. If you bought one of the longer rulers, the itty bitty 8s, you could use that. I'm going to go ahead and leave that folded in half. From this 1 5/8 inch wide strip, I need to cut 4 pieces that are 3 1/4. So since I have it folded in half, I'm cutting 2 at a time. 3 1/4 times 2 is 6 1/2. So I'm going to put my 6 1/2 inch mark on the short end right here, and then I want to make sure that I have lines running along my straight edges. So once you have it lined up, 6 1/2, cut, and then back to 3 1/4. And cut. So that gives me my 4 beige strips. On the beige, after I cut my 4 3 1/4 by 1 5/8 inch pieces, I need a piece that's 1 inch wide left, and I'm just lucky because I wasn't paying attention. And I do have a little bit wider than 1 inch left, so I should have been a little bit carefuler when I was squaring up. But I want it to be 1 5/8 by 1 inch wide. So I had cut the strip 1 5/8, so I've got my 1, so there's not a lot extra on that one. From our rust or red strip, we're going to cut a 6 3/4 inch piece off the end. Be careful because you don't have a lot extra on this. So I am just doing the 6 3/4. You want to make sure there's a 7-inch piece left on the other end, at least. And I do have just a little over 7. And we're going to cut this strip down to 1 5/8 inches wide. So just make sure you are getting that 5/8 inch mark along your long edge. And I'm not going to try to back up like I usually do with 5/8 inch measurements. I could make notes of what each increment was, but I'm going to be lazy this time and just cut off the ends. So make sure if you're using the itty bitty eighths that you follow all the way out to the edge. Make sure you're getting the 5/8 inch mark. And I'm also running any line along the long edge. And here I'm checking it again. And again, you do want to make sure you're getting that accurate eighth. And the 6 3/4 we cut off is giving us about 1/4 of an inch leeway here. So if the end wasn't straight, that's okay. So there's my 4 1 5/8 inch square pieces. From what's left of my rust, or red is what we really have, we want to cut a 7 by 1 3/4 inch strip, so 7 inches long. By 1 3/4 wide. And we're going to back the ruler up to 3.5 inches. And cut, which gives us our 2 pieces. From our green piece, we want a slice that is 1 by 3.5 and 2 1 5/8 inch squares. Your green is a little bit bigger than what the pattern called for. So I'm going to cut just a little bit wider than 1 inch off of one edge. And then I'll go ahead and cut it down to the 1 inch. And it should be about 3.5 inches long. We are going to be trimming this down after we sew, so if it's longer than that, that's okay. I'll go ahead and cut it. And then out of what is left, we want 2 1 5/8 inch squares. So I'm lining up my 1 5/8 inch mark with the edge that I just trimmed, cut, and I am going to square off one edge. Now 1 5/8 times 2 is 3 1/4, so I'll go ahead and cut it down to that. And then again, I'm going to cut down to the 1 5/8 inch mark here, following it all the way out, and cut. And that gives me my 2 1 5/8 inch squares. We're going to take our 1 5/8 by 1 inch beige piece and sew the 2 green squares on opposite sides of that. We are also going to take our other green piece and sew our 2 rust or red strips on opposite sides of that. So we're going to sew those 2 just like that. On both of these, I pressed away from the green, so toward the rust or red on this one, and then toward the cream on this one. So from our green and beige strip, we are going to cut a 1 inch slice out of there. We're going to clean up both edges. I'm lining up lines on my ruler with my seam, and you can also line up with your ends. Inch. And this piece should be 3 1/4 Whoa, I'm 3.5. Okay, I have found a mistake in the pattern. Back where it told us to cut our rust strips 1 3/4 wide, it should have been 1 5/8 inch wide. It switches the measurements when it's talking about those strips between what it tells us in step number 2 when we're cutting and step number 5 when we're sewing. So again, it's bigger, not smaller. So it really should be, if it was 1/8 of an inch less on each side of my rust or red. So I'm lining up my 1 3/8 inch now, because if we'd have cut it at 1 5/8, we had a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once we take that off, it's 1 3/8. So I'm lining my 1 3/8 inch mark up with my seam line, and I'm going to flip it around, do the same thing on the other side. The 1 3/8 inch mark on the seam line and cut. So now my piece should be 3 1/4. It is. From this, we're going to cut 2 pieces that are 1 5/8 inches wide. So I'm lining up lines on my seam allowances, clean cutting one edge. So 1 5/8 times 2 is 3 1/4. So I can line my 3 1/4 up on this cut edge. Again, I'm lining lines up with my seam allowance, cut, and move back to the 1 5/8 inch mark on my cut edge. And again, I have lines on my seam allowance to keep everything, or not my seam allowance, my seam line to keep everything straight. So now I have my 2 1 5/8 inch strips, and I am going to sew my narrow 1 inch strip in between those two, so I get an irregular 9 patch. Alright, once we have sewn this together, the pattern says to press out towards our rust or red. I didn't do that. I popped my seams so it pressed in different directions, and I got a nice flat intersections on that little tiny center. Now we're going to take our beige strips and sew them to 2 opposite sides of our 9 patch, and then we will take the other 2 beige strips and on the opposite ends of those sew our 1 5/8 inch squares. So we will do 2 sets of these and 1 of this. This one, everything got pressed toward the beige, so in towards the center on these 2 and out away from the center on that one. Our last step is to sew the 3 rows together, and the seams are going in opposite directions, so it should go together quite easily. Here's my finished comfort quilt block. My last seam allowances, I could have popped the seams, but I chose to press out because if I had popped them, then it was going to fold in on the center towards the smaller section, so I would have had more bulk there. It could go either way. Our final block for this month is Cornerstones. We have a orange strip, a beige strip, and a black rectangle. So from our orange strip, well, first off, we're going to cut it down to 1 1/2 inches wide. And I am going to clean cut one end. So 1 1/2. Just putting my 1 1/2 line on the long edge and cut. And then we need 4 1 1/2 inch squares. So 4 times 1 1/2 is 6 inches. 6. Move back to the 4 1/2 inch mark. The 3 inch mark. And the 1 1/2 inch mark. And then from what's left down on this end, we need about a 2 inch strip. So that's left over. So 4 1.5 inch squares and one piece that's 1.5 by 2. Our beige strip we're also going to cut down to 1.5 inches wide. I folded mine in half because again I'm working on a smaller surface than I do sometimes. And I am going to clean cut the end on this. Going to rotate it. Dangerous. You could rotate your mat or walk around. So 1.5 inches wide, and from that we need two 3.5 inch rectangles. So I'm going to just back off and cut off my 3.5, and since it's folded in half, I am cutting two at once. So there's my two 3.5, and then we need two 2-inch, and then this is extra. From our black rectangle, we need 4 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide by 3.5 inches long. So I'm going to clean cut 2 edges. Rotate. So I'm going to do the 3.5 here on the long edge, and 1.5 times 4 is 6 inches. So 3.5, 6, cut. Then we're going to back off to our 4.5 inch mark. To the 3 inch mark. And then finally to the 1.5 inch mark. So that gives us our 4 pieces. Now we're going to take our 2-inch long strips of beige and orange and sew them together like this along the long edge. I pressed toward the beige, and now I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip out of here. So I am lining up lines with my seams in the center, and you can also line up on the end. Clean cut one edge, rotate. Again, I'm lining up lines with the seam and with the ends. And now I'm going to line up my 1.5 inch line on the long edge and cut. And my next step is to take my 2 remaining beige pieces and sew them onto opposite sides of this so that my orange piece is surrounded by beige. Once again, I pressed toward the beige. Now we're going to take 2 of our black pieces and sew them on opposite sides of this. And we will also take the remaining 2 and add an orange square on the end of each of those. This time everything got pressed toward the black, so in towards the center on the top and the bottom row and away from the center on the middle. And now we're just going to sew those 3 rows together. Here's my finished Cornerstones block. After sewing these on, I did pop the seams in the corners so that I get a nice flat intersection there. It should be 5.5 inches, as should all the blocks this month.